Hello, welcome to my channel. Well, I had a disastrous day yesterday. I did a rather large video, a triptych, 3 paintings in one, and then I couldn't get the files off of my SD card. So I thought today, having found a miniature SD card and the adapter, that I might try something very simple just to test it all out. So I chose Hollyhocks, and here's the result. And I'm glad to say I managed to get all the files down. I ran out of palette paper. I'm using a 3/4 inch flat, and I'm using acrylic paints, titanium white, primary yellow, raw umber, raw sienna, French ultramarine blue, sap green, and alizarin crimson. That's my usual palette. I'm using 3 colours for the background, and I'm just slashing it on with my 3/4 inch flat. French ultramarine blue, sap green, and primary yellow, and titanium white too, which I put on at the end to give it a sort of misty look. I like that effect in the background, and I'll give you the link to my video painting easy backgrounds. I'll put it in the description below. I'm just using very rough crisscross strokes to put on the titanium white, to put on all the paint actually, because I have a powder brush that I got from the dollar store, and I use a powder brush to blend. I like a blended background. Now that's personal choice. You might like to see the brush strokes. I don't. I do in some of the elements of the painting, but not all, and the background is something I like to see smooth. So that's the way I do it, but you can decide for your painting and do it the way you like to see it. Now this is the type of powder brush I like to use, a big fluffy one, and I use that same crisscross motion and blend it all quite thoroughly for my paintings. Some paintings I like to see the texture in the background, but usually I draw it in with a brush. I draw in leaves and things sometimes. I didn't with this one, and I just blended until I got what I thought was a nice texture, I suppose, to the painting. Now I didn't turn my camera on, so I'm going to show you this again. I used a liner brush and raw sienna, and I drew a stem first, and then I drew the buds on that you often see at the top of the hollyhock where all the flowers haven't quite come out, and I just do simple lines for that because I'm going to paint that in later. Now I'm using alizarin crimson and a 1/2 inch flat, and I'm going to put in the centers of the flowers. Alizarin crimson is a little bit transparent for this particular job. I do use it on my roses. I find it works very well for that, and this is a similar flower to paint, believe it or not, and but I'm thinking this might be a little bit transparent, but we'll see how it goes. Before I paint flowers, I like to look at Google images of whatever it is I'm going to paint and get that idea in my head. And when I looked at hollyhocks, I found there were simple old-fashioned ones that I remembered from my childhood, but they're also beautiful double hollyhocks. I chose not to paint those. I think I like to stick with the simple ones. And so that's what I'm doing here, and I've clustered them around that main stem. I've mixed up a pink, and I'm pulling that in with a large flat from the outer edge of the flower to the center, and it gives a better shape to the petals. I don't actually know how many petals are in a hollyhock, but I suspect 5. They're usually odd numbers, and you can see that it's overtaken the alizarin crimson center, so I'm going to have to reinforce that at some point. I just stroke that petal in from the outer edge in toward the center, and I don't mind if they overlap somewhat. that's how flowers are. Some are more prominent, and I've made my lowest one the most prominent. No, actually the second from lowest, the most prominent, and the top one will be the lightest, will get the most light. And I think at some point I decide the light is coming from the right of the painting. So I'm reinforcing that red. I know I added magenta to my palette. I'm not sure if I show you that. This particular video is a little haphazard. I am just testing out to see if I can get everything, and I did manage to. So this miniature SD card works really well. You just sort of stick it in the adapter and then stick the whole thing in the side of your computer. Oh, and leaves. I'm using a mid-tone, a mixed sap green and primary yellow, a little titanium white, and sometimes for the darkest green I use French ultramarine blue. And these leaves on the hollyhock have sort of 5 lobes to them, but I'm just painting in a sort of semicircular leaf, and I will add the veins after to indicate the lobes. I've put that mid-tone green on the leaves and on the buds as well. I haven't done anything with the stem yet. This is where I added the magenta to my palette. I thought a brighter pink might help with the center. It is still a transparent color, but I think it's enough. I think it's going to work. I put a circle of the color on first, and then I use a damp brush to draw it in toward the center afterwards. I'm going to put another layer of pink on those petals, reinforce them a bit, and later on I'll use white in the areas where the light hits the petal. I don't add shade to the petal. I feel that the basic color is good enough, and I don't like to make my petals look heavy. So I usually only put on highlights rather than shadow on the petals. Sometimes I'll add a little more color, a little darker color, but mostly I think to keep the flower looking light and translucent, it's better just to put a highlight on it. I feel that the more paint you put on a flower, the heavier looking it becomes, and I don't like my roses, or in this case hollyhocks, to look leathery. So I try not to load too much paint on them. Having decided the light is coming from the right, I'm using straight titanium white to put a highlight on the petals that would be touched by the light, not on every petal, just where I think the light will hit. And although in that top one I seem to have decided it would hit everywhere, but I think for the rest of them I just do them on the right hand side. Maybe not. Actually, I think in this part I just decided that the petals needed to be stronger looking. The flowers were a little wimpy when I had them in the pink. For the centers of the flower, I'm mixing raw sienna with primary yellow, and I might add a touch of titanium to that. No, I don't do that. and I'm putting in the centers of the flower, which are quite raised little stamens, and I'll put a highlight on top of that. This is where I add primary yellow with a little titanium white in it, just as a highlight to dot on top of that raw sienna mixture. I don't know what you think, leave a comment if you like, but I think these are pretty good hollyhocks considering this is the first time I've done them. I'm not totally sure of this flower. Okay, this is where I decided to make the light come from the right. I had reinforced the pink earlier, and so everything that's on the left will be in shadow, the shadow side of the buds, shadow side of the leaves, and as I said, I don't put a shadow side on my flowers. In this case I don't. Most often I don't. It's just a funny thing, or quirk if you like, that I have. I do find it, the more paint you put on a rose, for instance, the more leathery it begins to look. Now I'm putting primary yellow into the mixture, a little titanium white as well, and I'm going to dab on the highlight side of the buds and leaves. I had a little too much water in my brush and it began to run down my painting, so I just took that off with my thumb. You can use paper towel for things like that. It's best just to make sure your brush doesn't have too much water in it. Okay, so now I'm putting a highlight on and I'm using straight titanium white. Just going to put it on the side that is hit by the light, and I have quite a lot of brush stroke in this. I'm not sure whether I'm happy with that. I think later on I take it out. When you're taking out a brush stroke that you don't like, use a clean damp brush, and I clean mine off on paper towel, make sure I've got no paint in there and that there's not too much water in it. And then just go over the stroke again, and that will smooth out the brush stroke. I decide that the centers are still not dark enough. If you look at a lot of the photographs, they have a really dark sort of magenta center, and it gives them the depth that you need in this flower because it's like a trumpet type flower. So I put a ring of the magenta around that stamen, but I came back in after and pulled that color back out into the petal with a damp dry brush, and you'll see how I do that, but I think it looks a lot better. I'm quite pleased with these hollyhocks. They turned out a lot better than I thought they would. Yeah, this is where I cleaned off my brush and started pulling that pink out into the petal. It's good that you see my errors as well as my successes. You learn something. I learn something every time I paint. And I enjoy it so much. I try to paint at least a couple of times a week. I used to paint every single day when I was first painting, but in more recent years I paint only a couple of times a week. But I've been painting for more than 30 years, so that's quite a lot of paintings. When I paint stems, I like to use colours like raw umber, alizarin crimson, French ultramarine blue. I like to get a lot of colour in my stems. They're not terribly interesting as a part of the flower, but you can make them interesting by which paints you choose. I'm using my light green mixture and a liner brush to put the veins on the leaves. You don't have to do that. I do it because I think it adds another texture, a little more interest to a painting to do that. You can use your brush to indicate those leaf lobes. I call them lobes. I don't know what anyone else calls them. And that is often sufficient. But in this case, I thought it would look better if I put the veins in with a liner brush. It's at this stage of the painting that I have to watch out because I can pick away at it until I've killed it off. And in this case, I've decided to add a little more magenta, and I think I'm doing the right thing here, but sometimes I just have to force myself to stand back and leave the painting alone and just look at it and just decide that it's finished. I do think that in this case my tinkering was a good thing. I think it's given a little more depth to the centre of the hollyhock flowers. Well, I think there's really nothing more to do, and I'm quite pleased with this picture. I think I will sign it and I'll put it up for sale on Etsy. I'll put a link in the description below, and thank you very much for watching, and I don't know what I'll be painting next time, but I hope you'll join me for whatever it is, and bye for now.